Okay, YouTube, I'm back at it again. This time I'm going to give something closer to a syllogism for this argument of mine, which I've had since the early parts of my channel. Okay, there's some external, these things are external to each other, okay? Pain and pleasure is not, it is punishment and reward according to normal, everyday people who are living in society in the world. You know, it's a part of, a lot of language is formed off of Christian doctrine. A lot of language, forms of language, a lot of a lot of the logic talked about in language. Like if you say, like, language will literally force you to say that things are equal to things that actually are just not true. Like there's false equivocations forced into language in the world because of Christian doctrine being such a huge part of language. Like it'll make you say that I am this or I am that, when in fact there's heavy criticism to you being those things. Like I was talking about how it makes you say that I am sad or I am angry, when in fact this couldn't be further from the truth. You're not really angry depending on the definitions used. Or I am sad, depending on the definitions used of sad. Maybe they'll invent definitions to match it better, but I'm not sure they would with the intention of making it match better. It's just something they would have done anyway. But talked about that a lot. But the same here, like pain and pleasure is not really punishment and reward necessarily, but depending on the definitions used. But well, I mean, actually it probably is, because punishment and reward is more flexible in its meaning. So, but don't think I'm talking about that sort of thing in this video. I'm not talking about the false equivalencies in language for that stuff. I'm just talking about why you should not assume that. I mean, look, pain and pleasure is a process. Those are processes. Punishments and rewards are processes, but you have to understand that these are all external to each other, and to some degree. Because here's the thing, right? Not all pains and pleasures you receive are actually necessarily fair punishments or just punishments, but they're at least going to be some kind of punishment or something like that. But as far as like a reward, if your reward is pleasure, then it's just, and that's one thing. But if you're being rewarded something and it's pleasure but it's not just, then it's just an unjust reward. So it's pretty flexible. But anyway, as I was saying, moving on. Then you have something like this. It says that I wrote all this. It's kind of, like I said, closer to a syllogism. Basically, as I've talked about, to pay for sins in the Bible, you have to follow this process I'm depicting. Even though the Bible does not say this explicitly, it is what it's hinting at and what it's actually saying. It's the logic. It is not what it's saying, but it's the logic it's using. But again, that doesn't mean that the writers actually knew what they were writing, and it doesn't mean that the consumers know what they're consuming, and it doesn't mean that, they understand their own logic. So like I said, that's mental illness, that's mistakes. It's not understanding what you're doing. If you don't understand what you're doing, you can't understand your own logic. Okay, so here you go. I mean, you can, but with the thing you're making a mistake with, there's something within that mistake that you do not understand the logic behind, so as for you to make the mistake. But I've talked about all this to holy hell anyway. But look, if a living entity should be sentenced to number 1, then that living entity must first undergo number 3, right? Because look, pain and pleasure, that's one thing, but if you're sentenced to pain and pleasure, then you have to think you must first undergo thinking of yourself and others to be sentenced to it. You can't just think yourself and then be sentenced to pain and pleasure necessarily. But you could, but typically what must first happen is they must undergo number 3, right? You're sentenced to it whether it's just or not, whether it's a just form of number 1 or not, you're still sentenced to it. You must first be sentenced to thinking of others and yourself typically. And then, but is number 3 number 1, or is number 3 just a process used to reach number 1? Number 3 is not number 1. Thinking isn't feeling, Pain and pleasure. It's pretty close to meaning as feeling, although it's not exactly the same. But I would say it's more or less a form of feeling. Those are more or less forms of feeling, because you feel pain and pleasure, right? But you don't feel it's like if feeling is the process to feel pain and pleasure, then that's one thing. So if you can feel pain and pleasure, then I'm not so sure that it would make sense to say that I think then that the pain and pleasure is external to the feeling, to feeling itself as a process. But unless you want to say it's all one and the same, like pain and pleasure is a process as well as a sensation, I'm going to go with that. A lot of people go with that. It's perfectly acceptable as a definition here to say that it's just a sensation as well as a process. And obviously you don't have a feeling and then you touch pain and pleasure, and no, it's not how it works. That's dumb. It's not how things work. It's not how logic works. It's more like you kind of just feel pain and pleasure, but it doesn't already exist. You don't touch it. It's not a physical thing to touch prior to the sensation beginning. It's just, it only exists when you feel certain things, when certain things touch. So yeah, you can look up the science behind that, but anyway, there's a science to all this. There's a science to everything. All these fields of study I've talked about, they're tied together, of course. The reasons I've said. Okay, so so obviously number 3 is not number 1, because if number 3 was number 1, then then there'd be no process to achieve number 1 or number 3. It's just all there would be. It wouldn't make any sense. And if number 3 is not number 1, then number 3 is only ever a process used to reach number 1. True. If number 1 exists and number 2 exists, do they go hand in hand with each other? Is number 1 the only way to achieve number 2? Yes. Because they go perfectly hand in hand with each other. If number 1 is the only way to achieve number 2, then sins cannot be paid for with number 3 alone. Because number 1 will always be a necessary part of the process of number 2. Number 1 is always a necessary part of the process of number 2. Number 2 is being the process of the forms of punishment and reward, whether they're just or not. Number 1 will always go hand in hand with it. If that doesn't exist, then number 2 doesn't exist. So basically, to achieve number 2, you need to achieve number 1. To achieve number 2, you need to achieve number 1, you need to achieve number 2. To To achieve number one, you need to achieve number two. And so basically, they're hand in hand. But number three can never happen. Number three can happen, but it's not actually number one or number two. It doesn't go hand in hand with them in the same way as number one and number two go hand in hand with each other. Or it does, but not enough for it to mean that, number three is number one or number two. Number one and number two are so much closer to each other than number three is to number two and number one. Because number two and number one literally go hand in hand. We're always thinking. We're always feeling. Although not all people although I will say, not everybody is always feeling, necessarily, depending on what's wrong with their body. As I've said, feeling is a physical thing, not a mental thing. And because to feel, you have to touch. So the mental is not physical, so it cannot be touched. It can't touch on anything. And so then you have number three is just a process used. One of several necessary but optional miscellaneous processes that must exist in order for number two and number one to occur. So basically, that means that how do I put it? You can never really how do I put it? It's not that at first you don't feel anything, and you're constantly being bombarded with number one, number two, number three since the moment you start being conscious. The moment you exist onward, all three of them you're going to constantly be experiencing. It's just the way it has to be. It's not like you can just pick and choose. There's natural parts of you, of your existence, and they're natural parts of everybody's existence. They're all necessary. If anyone is gone, existence would just not be what it is, and it would be better off not existing. It wouldn't even make sense in many regards. The laws of physics would not make much sense. But so it's not like they're optional. They all have to happen for things to exist. So basically, basically what that means is number three is like, how do I put this? Yeah, it's like saying that number three, they think number three comes before, for a person, number three comes before number one and number two. First they do number three, and then they start to have number one, number two. But that's not really how it works. Like I've been saying, I've been exposing lies of these so-called professionals in the medical field, so-called professionals in many fields, but I've already displayed I have much more wisdom when it comes to these things. These people are lying to you when they say, in your therapy session, for example, you need to first do number three. And after you do that, then you'll actually be able to do number two and number one. No, that's not how it works. You're doing all three all at the same time. That's actually how it works. Feeling doesn't come from thinking. That's not how it works, because feeling is a physical thing. It's a physical process, not a non-physical process. You're constantly feeling physical things. But if it were a mental thing, you would always be feeling. You would still be feeling things mentally anyway, because you'd constantly be thinking, and thinking doesn't create feeling. It's just, well, it's kind of like you could think without feel. You could think and not feel, but thinking would never not create feeling, is basically what I'm saying. And because of that, but the other thing is that it never really stops. The feeling never stops from the thinking. It just always happens. Even from a purely materialist perspective, this must be true, where feeling is a mental thing, not a physical. Not a materialist view. A view where you can feel things mentally. Even from that view, you're constantly feeling things mentally. So basically, there would never be a moment where you would think but not have mental thoughts but not also have mental feelings. It'd always be happening for as long as you exist. So although like I said, that doesn't mean that you can't feel things. I mean, that doesn't mean you can't think without feeling. You can, but there's different ways to do it. There's ways you could do it where it would be through paradoxes and defiance of the laws of logic, or there's ways you could do it that are not as much of a defiance of the laws of logic, where you could just think of it like robots. Like, they think, they process information, but they don't really feel anything. It's pretty similar to them. Or if we took away the emotional parts of the human brain, of a person's human brain, and all they had was thoughts, well, then they would still think, but they just wouldn't feel anything. I mean, this is my analogy. I mean, like I said, I know that I've already exposed why we don't really feel things mentally, but I'm speaking as if I think we do for my viewers, because they're still stuck on the idea that we do. So I'm just going to continue talking as if we do feel things mentally. So that's why I said that if we took things from the human brain that make us quote unquote, feel things mentally, we wouldn't anymore. We would just think. So imagine that. But, so imagine we think things, but we never feel anything. And then what do we have? We just have robots. So how can we enforce number 2 on something that does not feel and that will not feel? It just only thinks. You cannot care about something. You cannot care for something if you do not feel anything. Because care is through feeling and it's through emotion. It is not through thinking. I mean, it is through thinking, but care isn't thinking. It's emotion and it's feeling. Basically, thinking just leads to the care. It isn't the care itself. But people are so lazy thinkers in history, like I said, that they don't understand how things work, and they'll just like LARP, and they'll act like they understand how things work, and like brainwash people and followers into thinking they do, until like they get what they want. Like I said, that's just a lot of how things work that I'm trying to rebel against, and I am against the tyranny. But again, anyway, as I was saying, although thinking, well, I mean, thinking actually is kind of caring. It's just that I think I'm wrong about what I said earlier. I think it's that thinking is a form of care, but it doesn't really. But then, what are you caring for? If all there is thinking. If all that exists is thinking, and if all that ever existed was thinking, but there was never feeling, then what are you really caring for? Because then, if you're just caring for thinking, it's circular and it's spiteful. It's just you're thinking. All that happens is there's thinking just for spite. It's thinking just for thinking. There's no higher purpose or any spiritual meaning, and there's no meaning, and there's nothing that actually matters at that point. So it's not really like care, because it's like you're caring, but you're caring for nothing. It's a meaningless care. But if there's feeling, it's a care that actually has meaning, so that if there's actually something to protect, there's actually something to fight, worth fighting for. If all there is thinking, and all there ever was or ever could be was thinking, ever, then nothing would matter. There'd be nothing worth fighting for. Because nothing could be hurt. And if nothing could be hurt, if nothing could be hurt, then there'd never be a problem. The very discomfort that one may assert there would be in such a situation would not even apply, because again, that's only hurt itself. But it never would exist in the first place. So nothing would really matter. So nothing really matters without feeling. Therefore, it makes more sense to say that it's the only actual true forms of punishment and reward. That's why I said at the bottom. In other words, no amount of thinking on its own, number 3, will bring about number 2 and number 1. As 1, 2, and 3 are all completely external to each other, despite coexisting with each other. 2 and 1 are not created by 3, but they at least always coexist with 3. See, 2 and 1 aren't created by 3. They just coexist with it. That's why I said 3 could always exist, and it could be that 3 exists, but 2 and 1 don't. But then it would be meaningless. But that shows that 3 doesn't really create it on its own. In fact, it doesn't create it at all. It just coexists with them. That's why there can be a situation where unless you want to say that 3 starts to create 2 and 1 when you add in other things. But even then, it really doesn't. When you look at what other things it could be added in. So 3 does not create 2 and 1. It just coexists with them and goes hand in hand with them, but it doesn't create them. Just because you go hand in hand with something doesn't mean you're created by it. Just because a thing goes hand in hand with you doesn't mean you created it. That just makes no sense. Like, I go hand in hand with my cell phone. It doesn't mean I created it. I go hand in hand with my cell phone. It doesn't mean my cell phone created me. So the same is with thinking and number 3 and number 2 and number 1. It goes hand in hand with them, but they didn't create each other. So, which is why basically you can't, like I said, you can't pay for sins without number 1 and 2. Number 1 because it's feeling, but if, like I said, it's meaningless if you just think. If all there ever was is thinking, then nothing matters. If nothing matters, then there can be no punishment. But if things matter, there can. And the only way things can matter is with feeling. Therefore, there is only punishment and reward when there starts to be feeling. There never is when there isn't. It's a hit or miss. It's this or that. It's not like there's a spectrum of answers. So therefore, like I was saying all along, is right. All injustice in life, all injustices ever will have to have been paid for with pain and pleasure. Using those are the units of measure, like I was saying. Like the amount of injustice, you're due a certain amount of pain for the injustice you cause, and you're due an amount of pleasure for the justice you cause. It's that simple. And like I said, it's a part of fairness. That's a principle of fairness, and it's a thing about equal distribution among the rights of all. If what I've talked about in this little syllogism is true, then it must mean that I was right, that everybody has right. Every living thing is entitled to natural rights, God-given rights, that transcend the thoughts and opinions of average people who think themselves to be high and mighty, but are really just ants in the grand scheme of things. But I hope you enjoyed. Please like, share, subscribe.